the event today. Claire, I believe you might have young people at home, which is why you chose to pre-record, just to avoid disruption.
You never quite know when someone's going to come into the room and start screaming.
Yeah, we understand. It's probably been I'm sure there's probably other people in the audience as well who know exactly what you've been going through over the past few months. So we're very grateful that you chose to pre-record it, but equally that you are here. So we'll play and show obviously your session from earlier, but you're going to be staying on hand, so we'll collect any questions and we'll go live to some questions afterwards as well. So are we okay with the recording? If I just look at Jen, wonderful. Thank you very much, and over to
Thanks for having me. All set? Let's go. My name is Clare Lang. I'm a partner at MFG Solicitors, and I'm going to be talking to you today in relation to setting up a connected charity and what is involved in setting up a connected charity, some of the benefits, sort of possible structures for the connected charity, and also some of the risks and management issues involved in having a connected charity, the matters that the Charity Commission will be looking to ensure are monitored and dealt with. So I will share my screen with you. Hopefully you can all see these slides. And obviously, just by way of introduction, yes, love education charities. If you just look at the Sunday Times rich list, whether it's Lord Sainsbury or Stormzy, they are all getting in on the act of giving to education charities. Actually, if you analyse the list, over half of those on the giving list have actually committed some or all of their gifts to education charities. So it's a very good way of fundraising through an alternative revenue stream. The Charities Act specifically lists advancement of education as a charitable purpose, and under charity law, the definition of advancement of education is quite wide. It's not just education in a classroom environment. It can be both formal education as well as community education, physical education, training or vocational training or life skills training, research and specific areas of expertise, or just the development of specific areas of study. So I've listed some of the key types of organisations which should qualify for charitable status on the basis that they are capable of advancing education. So traditional education establishments such as colleges, schools, universities, organisations which support those establishments, for example, the Prince's Teaching Institute or Ambition Institute or Whole Education, all of which provide support to teachers. Preschools and out-of-school education groups such as playgroups, Saturday schools, some schools homework clubs, organisations that support physical education such as the Youth Sports Trust, which supports over 20,000 schools, or Greenhouse Sports, which works with children in London who have social problems or are truants. Organisations that provide life skills training, for example, Re-Entry in Wolverhampton, which works with young children who have come out of the school system for a reason and aims to get them back into the school system or into college or in a work placement or into employment. And then there's research foundations, think tanks, learned societies such as the Royal Geographical Society, museums and galleries and libraries and science institutes, funding, education funding institutes, and organisations which educate in particular subjects, for example, human rights. And then information media such as information centres and university press. So, you know, it's no surprise that lots of existing education sector organisations identify the need to raise additional resources and facilities and realised that setting up a charitable vehicle can be a really effective way of enabling fundraising and also utilising some of the benefits of charitable status. So Oaks has introduced MFG, and we've worked with Oaks on a couple of setups of separate charitable vehicles. Core Education Trust in Birmingham, which is a multi-academy trust, set up a separate charitable vehicle which is going to execute projects such as the Echo Eternal project, which involved learning through performances inspired by Holocaust survivor testimonies. Another one here is Low Hill Nursery in Wolverhampton. Oaks and MFG collaborated on the setup of a CIO by the nursery. It's a charity called Every Family Counts, which is committed to supporting families who need help by delivering courses and providing support to them to enable them to become resilient and develop life techniques. So some of the benefits of charitable status we've already touched on, obviously, attracting fundraising. Profits of charitable companies won't be subject to corporation tax, and donations are obviously boosted by the various tax reliefs, such as gift for aid relief, donations into payroll giving schemes, and gifts of money from other charities and companies won't be subject to tax. Neither will fundraising profits, and property transactions. If the property, if it's a property acquiring vehicle, that won't be subject to stamp duty, land tax. Business rates are also heavily discounted, so it will be a discount of at least 80%, and sometimes there can be a possibility of topping that up to 100%. It's quite confusing because there's various charitable legal structures, and these are the main three that are used, although there are others less commonly used. A charitable trust, a charitable company, and a charitable incorporated organisation, or CIO, are the three key ones. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about what they are and when you might use them. So a charitable trust, that's an unincorporated charity. It's not a legal entity in its own right, no separate legal personality. So contracts and obligations can't be entered into with a charitable trust of itself. They have to be entered into by the trustees in their personal capacity. So it's quite laborious if there's a change in trustees and they've acquired a property or entered into a contract. Every time there's a change in trustee, the contract has to be transferred to the new trustees, or the property has to be transferred. And because the trustees contract in their individual capacity, they can actually be jointly and severally personally liable for the debts and liabilities of the charitable trust. That is distinct from a company or a CIO, where you do have the benefit of limited liability. There's no separate members, so there's only the trustees, so there's no sort of separate corporate governance checking by having a multi-layered structure. And you might want to use a charitable trust where it's a very simple situation. For example, it's just a simple donor or a family or a small group of people who want to regulate how they're going to settle money for charitable purposes. You might use a charitable trust where whatever the charity is going to engage in, it's not high risk. So, for example, it's just going to give grants. It's not going to enter into contracts or property contracts or employ people. The more commonly used is a charitable company, which is incorporated. So there's a dual system here. first the company has to be incorporated at Companies House, and then it has to be registered as a charity with the Charity Commission. Obviously, the constitutional documents used by the company will be in the form of charitable constitutional documents. The company will have separate legal personality, so it will be able to enter into contracts itself. It will be able to acquire property, to sue and be sued. Any property that's held by the company will be held by the company itself, and the members of the company will have limited liability. So unless the directors have done something fraudulent, or they've traded wrongfully, or when they knew the company to be insolvent, there's no likelihood of personal liability for the directors. There's also a separation of the directors and the members, so you will have a dual system where you have a body of members that normally includes persons other than the directors, which is quite democratic. So there'll be individuals or organisations involved in the charity who elect out of their number the directors who run the day-to-day business of the company. You can have it where the members and the directors are the same, but probably a charitable company works for bigger companies where you do want that dual system of corporate governance, that check on the directors' activities by the members. Most importantly, a charitable company has limited liability. So most charitable companies are set up as companies limited by guarantee, which purely means that in the event of the winding up of the company, and the company will just be insolvent, and all the members will have to contribute is the amount they've agreed to in the constitutional documents, normally about £10. So charitable companies suitable for medium-sized and large charities where there's a certain level of risk. So the charity is going to be owning land or employing staff, entering into significant contracts and funding arrangements, because it's got the benefit of limited liability. It's also a good structure because it has a separate membership who will keep the directors in check. Also, if the charitable company is going to be borrowing, there's an ability to register charges against the assets of the charitable company at Companies House, so that's quite attractive to lenders. The next one is a charitable incorporated organisation, or a CIO. So these were specifically brought in by the Charity Commission in 2013, and unlike companies, they are purely registered with the Charity Commission. They can't exist until their details are entered onto the Register of Charities by the Charity Commission. So like a company, it's got separate legal personality, it can contract and hold property in its own right, and there's a two-tier structure with charity trustees and members who can be the same people, although again, like a company, it could be completely separate. And the members will have to act in what they consider is in the best interest of the company, of the CIO, rather like a company. So it's really well suited because it's been specifically designed for charities. It's a good choice where there is going to be a level of risk assumed by the charity. So people are going to be employed, they're going to be entering into contracts and perhaps acquiring land and assets, perhaps taking out borrowings, and the administrative requirements associated with the CIO are less stringent than with a company, as it just has the one reporting regime to the Charity Commission, whereas a company has to report to Companies House and the Charity Commission and file accounts with both. So typically, when we look at working with Oaks on setting up separate vehicles. It will be a CIO or in some cases a company. So I've got a little flow chart here which basically reflects what we've just discussed. So if it's a larger charity, if there is some risk involved in what it's going to be doing, then typically it will be better to go down the company with the CIO route. Where you have decided to set up a charity as a separate entity, but there is some connection between the existing entity and the charity, then there are a lot of things to consider in terms of assessing and managing the risks to the charity and the relationship between the two entities. So it's not illegal to have a connection between a non-charitable organisation and a charitable one. The purpose of the charity must, being connected, must be to make a positive difference to the beneficiaries, and it can be a really good source of funding, or there can be other valuable resources that are contributed by the non-charitable entity to help save money. There can be lots of opportunities created by the association with the non-charitable entity, and it can be a really effective trading structure to raise funds. So it could take the connection could take the form of getting regular funding or support from the non-charity, or vice versa, or both entities working together in terms of delivering services or campaigns or projects. Or the charity could have a non-charity as a trustee, or its sole or significant member. That could be the connection between the two of them. So when you're managing a charity connected to a non-charity, you need to ensure that the charity is always working on achieving just its charitable purposes for the benefit, and it isn't supporting any non-charitable purposes. There have to be quite stringent controls on how the charity is spending its funds and using its resources to ensure that there's no benefit that's non-incidental occurring to the non-charitable entity. There needs to be a clear understanding of the purpose of the connection between the two. So it needs to be clear that the reason for the connection is to benefit the charity, and that it's in the charity's best interests. Obviously, the non-charitable entity isn't going to be subject to charity law and the same requirements as the charity. So there has to be an understanding of the responsibility to uphold the charity's reputation. And I think I've already touched on there should be no sort of private benefit to the non-charity or the people connected with it. So the Charity Commission has set out 6 principles which they expect trustees to follow in terms of managing and reviewing connections to non-charities. And it's important that trustees follow these principles to make sure they're acting in line with their trustees' duties. So it can, the main one that the Charity Commission is concerned that people follow is to recognise the risks. So the connection can obviously, as we've talked about, increase the risks that the charity supports or carries out work outside its charitable purposes or acts outside charity law rules. For example, there might be conflicts of interest arising. They also want to make sure that there's no control or inappropriate influence in decision making by the connected non-charity, and that there's no reputational harm arising from the association between the two. There should be no inappropriate support or benefit to the non-charitable entity or people connected with it as a result of the association between the two. And the Charity Commission is also quite concerned about the risk of the public and donors not being able to tell the two entities apart, particularly if there's similar branding or joint marketing. So the Charity Commission wants trustees to review those risks and keep this review, make sure it's done regularly. So for example, with larger charities, it would be important to do the review, I would say at least on an annual basis, if not more. The second principle is that the charity doesn't fund any non-charitable purposes. So trustees mustn't allow the charity's resources to support any non-charitable purposes when they're carrying out joint projects or giving funding or receiving funding. They must be able to show that any benefit to the non-charity from the connection is incidental. So the third principle is independence. The charity must be able to evidence that it can operate independently from the other entity. So the charity must only exist to further its own charitable purposes for public benefit and be governed by trustees acting only in the interest of the charity. So if the other organisation provides the charity's funding, trustees need to have a choice about accepting the charity's funds and terms and be able to recognise and address conflicts of interest. They can have trustees appointed by the other organisation, but the other trustees must be free to make their own decisions. The fourth principle is avoiding unauthorised personal benefits and addressing conflicts of interest. So conflicts of interest are bound to arise where there's a connection with a non-charity, perhaps because a trustee is going to benefit personally in some way from the charity's arrangement with connected non-charity, or because the trustee owes or feels some sense of duty or loyalty to the non-charity. So there must be a way of monitoring and making sure that these issues don't arise. So there must be a way of authorising any trustee benefit, and there must be an ability to identify and address any conflicts of interest. So a procedure whereby perhaps the conflicted trustee drops out of the decision-making process. Typically, the Charity Commission will want to see that the charity's got enough trustees not affected by the conflict of interest, that the one affected can drop out of the decision-making process. The fifth principle is maintaining the charity's separate identity. So, for example, some charities might have sort of overlapping financial structures with the non-charity. It's very important that those structures are kept completely separate. And also branding and identity must be kept distinctive so that there's no risk of the public or donations going to the wrong entity, or the public not being clear on where their money is being spent. So trustees should be able to show that they've considered and assessed any risks where there is a joint identity. Principle 6 is protection of the charity. So trustees must be satisfied that everything that's done is in the charity's best interests. So, for example, where there's joint contracts, trustees must be able to consider alternatives for achieving the charity's objectives, perhaps obtaining services or resources from elsewhere. And they should know the risks and how to manage them, and act with reasonable care and skill, taking professional or specialist advice where it's necessary. Trustees need to be satisfied that they're getting good value for money when they're paying the non-charity for services or resources, or sharing services or resources, and ideally the Charity Commission will want to see that there are written agreements in place between the non-charity and the charity, and also be satisfied that the trustees of the charity are willing to enforce any terms against the non-charitable entity. So in the event that there's been a serious breach of the principles we've talked about, the Charity Commission does have the ability to open a statutory inquiry to obtain evidence and use its enforcement powers to protect the charity's assets or ensure that they're properly used. They could, in the worst case scenario, decide that the charity exists to fund non-charitable purposes, and in the worst case scenario, that could lead to the charity being removed from the charities register, or any tax benefits that have been obtained being withdrawn and tax being repayable. There could be fines or penalties and liability, personal liability for trustees in the event of the charity suffering loss because of breach of duty by the trustees. So it's very important for trustees that all the Charity Commission principles are adhered to, that any trustees meetings minute that they have considered any conflicts of interest or issues such as we've talked about. So just to sum up, where you are looking to register a charity which has a connection to a non-charitable entity, the Charity Commission will expect to see that the charities run completely independently, and so ideally different trustees, or perhaps just a minority of trustees who are connected with the non-charitable entity, and that the charity has the ability to choose the activities it's carrying out to achieve its purposes. So this means that the charity is able to negotiate and reject perhaps any funding terms proposed by the organisation, decide the terms of contracts and look to see whether they can get better terms elsewhere. The charity trustees must be able to decide how any funds that are raised are held and accounted for and spent. So that shouldn't be controlled by the non-charitable entity or its connected persons. So ideally, you'd want to see that decision-making processes are made completely independently from the existing charity, the existing non-charitable entity. There must be freedom to choose your own legal and accountancy and other advisors, and also there should be a policy for addressing conflicts of interest. So trustees should go through a procedure at trustees meetings of considering whether there are any conflicts of interest, and ideally trustees who are conflicted should step out of the decision-making process there. So that's it from me. I'll be around for any Q&A at the end, and also if anyone would like to contact me either by email or give me a call, I'd be more than happy to assist with any queries. Thanks a lot, and thank you for listening. Bye.
Thank you. We should be back hopefully live. We are. Hello, Claire. Thank you for that.
All seemed to work okay, didn't it?
It worked perfectly. Thank you so much. It was really, really
I think about
thorough.
2/3 of the way I'd run out of water and my throat started going, but I persevered anyway.
No, it was absolutely epic. Thank you. And thank you for joining us for just a couple of questions, which we have had. Okay. So just to kick off, I've had a really interesting question, which is, in your experience and your knowledge, when a school or a multi-academy trustee is really thinking about embarking on this, they want to go for it, who do you think they should really be involving in the discussion, I guess in the kind of permission piece and the governance piece, and what sort of time frame or model or way do you think that might best work?
Yeah, well, I suppose in the first instance, they need to have a clear plan of what they're actually intending to do. So they probably, someone like Oaks, for example, to scope it all out for them and put together an advice piece on the best way of structuring it, which they can then take to their governors to talk to them about. They really need to think about, how they're going to structure it, how they're going to show this you know, clear separation between the two entities, because often, you know, people come to us and say we want to have the same people as trustees of the separate charity vehicle that we're looking to establish, which obviously isn't the best way. So I suppose they need to have a team in place that is going to take the new charity forward before they present it to the governors. So, I mean, in terms of time frame, it really depends. It can vary, and sometimes it's quite, it depends who you get looking at your application at the Charity Commission. Sometimes they go through immediately, as I'm sure you know. Sometimes it can take months and months. I've had some going on for probably best part of a year, unfortunately. So, you know, it completely varies. But I mean, if you kind of have a clear plan, and I know that, you know, when Oaks look at it, they will identify all the issues that the Charity Commission is likely to pick up on, so that when the application is made, any issues are headed off in the first instance, and you have got a clear structure that the Charity Commission is going to look at and say, okay, they've thought about addressing any kind of conflict of interest type issues. We have got two totally separate structures here, even if there are various connections between the two entities, then it should hopefully go through quite quickly. So yeah, I think getting to a planning stage before you get that approved by the governors, and then you can crack on and go ahead with the actually making the application. Yeah. Probably save time in the long run.
And why do you think this is possibly a little bit still quite new to the sector? Is it not really well known, or do you think it is just risk aversion, or it's just a challenge, or people just think, oh, I haven't got the time to sort of comprehend and plan for it? Why do you think it's still?
Yeah. You'd think it wouldn't. It would be more popular, especially since, you know, 2013 they brought in the CIO, which was intended to make everything a lot easier. And you know, it is quite surprising when education is so popular in terms of you know, a charitable vehicle. It does, you know, philanthropists do really like charities. So I'm not really sure. I suppose it's perhaps it's just the concept of the complexity and the fact that it's, you know, still a lot of people don't actually understand what's involved in setting it up, and it probably does, you know, I think once it's all set up and running, it probably is quite straightforward, but the actual process of going through forming it is probably quite overwhelming for people. So perhaps they need to streamline it a bit more and make it a bit easier for people.
Yeah, absolutely. I suppose that continues with this message and theme that seems to be going through today around collaboration. As long as we're sharing learnings and sharing experiences, we seem to be able to break down those barriers a little bit, and things seem a little less overwhelming.
Yeah.
And I guess in your experience as well, so much has been quite dependent on that, as we've again covered it, the stakeholders that are involved, and just how perhaps open-minded or even risk-averse boards are. But once they really want to engage in those conversations, at least you're identifying the opportunity and coming up with some reasoning as to why or why not it's not a good opportunity for you.
Yeah, it's a shame really when there are these, obviously, you know, if you're involved in the sector and there's such desperate needs for additional funding, and it's such a great way of you know, raising these additional funds, that it's not a bit more straightforward and accessible for people. You know, for example, you know, if you are going to go down the company route or the CIO route, that's not really something that you can do without involving professionals. And, you know, it's quite complex in terms of kind of the admin and reporting requirements to Companies House and the Charity Commission. So perhaps they do need to streamline it a bit and make it a bit more accessible. Obviously, they're balancing that with, you know, obligations to control, you know, look after the public and ensure that everything is done properly and the public know that the charity is being operated appropriately.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Claire. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you here and talk to the audience. Thank you so much. Again, I'll just...
Is there any other questions?
Yeah.
Feel
So
free
the
to
words right from me. She's more than happy to take them from you. So we'll be sharing your details and obviously MFG's details with the audience afterwards, so they can get in touch with you offline as well. You've been a great help to Oaks. We've been super appreciative to work with you, and I'm sure everyone else will feel the same when they reach out to you afterwards.
Likewise.
Thanks so much, Claire. Everyone who's watching, we're going to take a quick sort of 15-minute pause.